The late winter wind came down from the northern ridge like a creature with sharp teeth, nipping at faces, tugging at coats, and reminding every soul in Ash Hollow that mercy was as scarce as green grass in February. On mornings like this, even sunlight felt brittle. It fell thinly across the frozen ground, unsure whether to warm the earth or let the cold keep its claim. Folks gathered anyway, boots scraping over the frost-crusted dirt, their breaths drifting like pale ghosts as they crowded around the wooden platform in the center of town. Eliza May Harrow stood upon that platform with her hands folded in front of her, fingers stiff and raw from the cold. Her shawl, patched too many times to count, fluttered against her thin frame. A small gray kitten lay tucked beneath the wool, trembling faintly, its tiny head peeking out as though it too wondered how life had led them both to this moment. Eliza did not look at the men below. She kept her eyes on the far hills, where the sky sagged low with winter clouds, as if she might slip into them if she stared hard enough. The auctioneer, Silas Cobb, cleared his throat with a self-important noise and slapped his ledger shut. His coat strained around his middle, his gloves worn smooth by many such mornings. He had a voice that loved attention even when he didn't deserve it, and it boomed across the street with the force of someone who cared more for sound than sense. He spoke her name plainly as though listing off a broken plow, then gestured lazily to her as though the world needed proof of her existence. A few men chuckled. Others looked her up and down with a mix of curiosity and indifference. Barrett Doyle, tall and broad with a mean jaw and whiskey staining his tongue, spat into the snow and announced loudly that winter must be starved indeed if even the town's charity had run dry enough to put a woman and her kitten on display. His friends laughed, eager to echo the sound of someone stronger than themselves. Eliza kept her chin lifted, though her knees wavered under the weight of cold and humiliation. She had been tired for weeks, ever since the fire that swallowed her cabin, taking with it her mother's quilt, her father's tools, and every scrap of a life she had tried so desperately to hold together. The only surviving thing had been the kitten, found crying in the ashes, its tiny body coated in soot. She had wrapped it beneath her shawl and walked until her boots split open, hoping the town might offer work or shelter. Instead she found only stares. Hunger clung to her like a second skin. Silas raised his hand and called for the first bid. No one spoke. A crow cawed overhead, breaking the silence as though mocking them all. Finally Barrett offered a number barely high enough to buy a week's worth of hay. The crowd murmured. Silas sighed. And Eliza felt something inside her curl inward like a leaf touched by frost. The kitten mewed then, soft and helpless. The sound carried farther than any insult, drifting between the bodies in the crowd until even the horses tied nearby flicked their ears. Eliza pressed her hand against the creature, rubbing its small head with the gentleness of someone who had learned long ago how to love things that needed saving. From the edge of the gathering, a tall figure watched. Jonas Wilder, a rancher known more for silence than speech, stood with his hat low against the wind. Snow dusted the shoulders of his coat like fine ash, and the lines of his face revealed little beyond the patience of someone acquainted with solitude. He was not a man who wasted words, nor one who lingered in town for pleasure. Folks said you could count the number of times he had smiled in a year on one hand. Others claimed he spoke mostly to horses, who at least listened without judgment. Yet his gaze did not waver from Eliza. Not once. There was something in the way she stood, straight back despite the cold, steady despite the cruelty, that stirred in him a quiet ache he had not expected to feel. He recognized it, for he had worn it himself once. The posture of someone bracing against a world determined to take more than it ever offered. Silas called for another bid. None came. Barrett grunted, annoyed by the lack of amusement, and raised his price by a small margin, enough to keep the crowd entertained. Eliza looked down then not at the men but at the kitten, who blinked up at her with trusting eyes. She whispered a small apology into its fur, though her lips barely moved and the wind carried the sound away before anyone could hear it. Silas rolled his eyes and prepared to close the auction with a dismissive slap of his ledger. That was when Jonas stepped forward. He moved without announcement, without haste. Boots crunching in the frost, shoulders squared, jaw set. Every eye turned toward him. Barrett smirked, expecting a challenge. But Jonas didn't look at Barrett. He didn't look at Silas. He only looked at Eliza. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather pouch, and placed a sum upon the table so high the crowd went silent. Shock rippled through them like wine through dried prairie grass. Even Silas hesitated, glancing between Jonas and the money as though wondering whether this was a joke or a miracle. Barrett cursed under his breath. The other men shifted uneasily. Eliza blinked, unsure whether she was imagining him. The kitten peeked out again, ears twitching, sensing the shift in the air. Jonas's eyes held hers with a steadiness that felt warmer than his coat. He gave her the slightest nod, quiet as breath. Silas, eager not to lose face, slammed his stamp onto the ledger and declared the auction closed. Jonas stepped toward the platform. His coat rustled softly as he lifted it from his shoulders and draped it over Eliza, the weight comforting, the warmth immediate. She inhaled sharply, not from fear but from the unfamiliar sensation of being shielded rather than exposed. He held out his hand, not demanding, simply offering a way down. Eliza hesitated only a moment before placing her fingers in his. His grip was firm, careful, steady. The kitten burrowed deeper into her shawl as Jonas guided her from the platform, parting the crowd without force, only quiet certainty. They reached his wagon, frost dusted across the wooden boards, and he helped her climb inside. Snow began to fall then, slow and drifting as though the sky itself exhaled. Jonas settled into the driver's seat, reins in hand. Behind them, Barrett stared with a look that promised trouble. And as the wagon creaked forward into the pale winter morning, Eliza felt, for the first time in months, the faint stir of something like hope. She did not yet see the danger following her. But Jonas did. Snow drifted in soft, wandering flakes as Jonas guided the wagon along the narrow road leading away from Ash Hollow, the reins held lightly in his hands, as though he trusted the horses to understand the journey better than he did. The late winter sky sagged low, brushing the tops of the bare cottonwoods with a silver-gray heaviness that made the world feel hushed, suspended between breath and silence. Eliza sat with the kitten curled beneath her shawl, Jonas's coat heavy across her shoulders, its warmth sinking into her bones like something she had forgotten she needed. The farther they traveled from town, the more her pulse slowed, though her thoughts churned in uneasy circles. She did not know Jonas Wilder. She did not know what price she had become worth to him or why he had stepped forward when the rest of the world looked through her as if she were a smudge on glass. She studied the side of his face when she thought he wouldn't notice, the calm set of his jaw, the faint scars along his cheekbone, the way he leaned slightly forward with every gust of cold wind as though shielding the horses as much as himself. He spoke nothing. Perhaps he didn't know what to say. Perhaps he had said all that mattered when he placed that impossible sum on Silas's table. Or perhaps silence was simply the language of a man who had learned the world changed shape when words were used carelessly. Eliza pulled the coat tighter. It smelled faintly of pine resin, smoke, and something warm she couldn't name. The scent startled her with its gentleness, so unlike the sour breath and heavy boots that had circled her in town. For a moment her throat tightened, fear and relief twisting together until she could barely distinguish them. After a long stretch of road where snow whispered against the wagon rails, Jonas nudged the horses to a slower pace. His voice came low, steady, almost hesitant. "You're safe." The words settled in her like a fragile promise placed in unsteady hands. She nodded, unsure she trusted herself to speak. The kitten stretched against her ribs, letting out a tiny purr that sounded like gratitude stitched into sound. The land began to change as they traveled deeper into the valley. Hills softened. Wind eased. The sky opened into a pale, shimmering blue. Jonas guided the wagon toward a creek bed where thin layers of ice clung to the rocks like delicate glass wings. In the distance, she saw smoke rising, a thin, peaceful ribbon drifting from a cabin chimney. Her breath caught. The cabin sat warm against a line of pines, its wood dark and well-kept, its barn standing tall beside it. It looked like a place where winter might knock but not break in. A place where a person could breathe without worrying the world meant to take something from them. Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop beside the porch. He stepped down first, brushing snow from his hat before moving toward her side. He did not offer to lift her down at once, not until her foot slipped on the edge of the wagon rail. Only then did he extend his hands, palms steady, open. She placed her fingers in his, and he supported her lightly, careful not to make her feel owned or fragile. Her boots found the ground, and she exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Warm air wafted from the cabin door when Jonas opened it, a mixture of stew, firewood, and the faint sweetness of something baking. She stepped inside slowly as though the room might reject her if she crossed too boldly. The kitten leapt from her arms, scurrying toward the hearth with a needy eagerness that made Jonas almost smile. Eliza watched him remove his gloves and hang them by the door. He moved with a quiet rhythm, every gesture simple yet deliberate, the kind of movements belonging to a man accustomed to being alone. She wondered how long it had been since another voice filled these walls. How long since he had allowed someone into the gentle order of his life. He gestured toward a chair near the fire. "Sit if you want." His tone wasn't commanding. It was an offering. She lowered herself into the chair, the warmth soaking into her like sunlight after too many storms. Jonas ladled stew into 2 bowls, placing one on the small table beside her without forcing conversation. When she whispered thank you, his nod was almost shy. The stew tasted of potatoes, smoked venison, and herbs, flavors that wrapped around her hunger with something deeper than nourishment. She closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of eating without being stared at, without feeling she had to apologize for existing. Jonas took the other chair opposite her. The fire flickered between them, warming the reddish tones of his beard and softening the sternness of his features. He watched the flames, not her, but she sensed he was listening to the quiet in the room, measuring it carefully. After several minutes he spoke again. "I didn't buy you." The words startled her. She set her spoon down, the bowl trembling slightly in her hands. "I just wanted to get you out of there." His voice carried no expectation, no hidden intention, only plain truth. "You can stay here until you decide where you're going next." Her chest tightened. No one had ever given her a choice without a condition tied to the end of it. She looked around the room, the wooden walls, the tidy shelves, the gentle glow of the fire. It felt safe, too safe for someone who had lived with danger pressed against her like a shadow. The kitten crawled into Jonas's lap without hesitation, curling instantly against his steady warmth. Jonas stroked its back with a gentleness that made Eliza blink in surprise. A man who barely spoke, a man with hands strong enough to bend metal, petting a creature small enough to fit in his palm. Something in that sight softened a part of her chest she thought winter had frozen for good. Outside, wind brushed against the cabin walls, a reminder that the world beyond was still cold and sharp. Jonas glanced toward the window, his expression darkening just slightly. She followed his gaze, seeing nothing but swirling snow, yet sensing something beneath it. Something unseen. Something watching. Jonas rose and latched the door with a quiet finality. He didn't say why. But Eliza, her heart suddenly tight, understood that safety came with shadows trailing close behind it. Dawn crept into the valley like a shy visitor, touching Jonas's cabin with pale strokes of gold that warmed the frosted windows and softened the long night's chill. Eliza woke to the faint crackle of the fire he had banked before sleeping, the room still gently glowing. The kitten lay curled at her side, its tiny breath steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat against the quiet. For a moment she stayed still, letting the warmth soothe the last remnants of fear tangled in her sleep. Then she rose slowly, taking in the room that had sheltered her through the storm of her arrival. Jonas was already outside, his silhouette moving across the yard with the deliberate calm of someone born to early mornings. She watched through the small window as he checked the fence line, scattering feed for the hens, his breath lifting in small clouds. There was a steadiness in the way he moved, no rush, no hesitation. A man who made decisions with the patience of someone who understood the land and trusted time more than impulse. She wrapped herself in the coat he had draped around her the night before and stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked softly under her boots. Jonas looked up, pausing mid-step, his eyes catching the morning light in a way that made them seem warmer than they were. He gave a slight nod, his greeting quiet but certain. "You slept warm?" She nodded. The cold air nipped her cheeks, but his presence steadied her. "Thank you for last night." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he returned to scattering feed, letting the hens cluck around his boots. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. A person shouldn't shiver inside their own skin. Something in that statement loosened a knot inside her, one she didn't know had tightened until relief touched it. They spent the morning in small, necessary tasks. Eliza swept the cabin's floor, discovering a satisfaction in the rhythmic scrape of the broom across the planks. Jonas repaired a leather saddle strap, the sound of his tools blending with the gentle crackle of the fire. When she stepped out later with a bucket of water drawn from the well, she found him chopping wood beside the barn. She paused. His movements were slow, measured, powerful. Each swing of the axe drove a clean split through the log, sending fragments scattering in crisp bursts. Yet there was no violence in the motion, only mastery, a deep understanding of force and restraint. The kitten trotted after him, batting it with chips with unearned bravery. Jonas paused mid-swing, lowering the blade until the kitten scampered away again, satisfied with its tiny victories. Eliza smiled without meaning to. Jonas noticed, though he pretended not to. Something about this brought a warmth to her chest that no coat could match. They ate midday at the small table, silent except for the sounds of spoons and the kitten's soft purring underfoot. Eliza felt herself wanting to speak, to share pieces of her story, the parts she'd buried, the parts that hurt too much to carry alone. She waited until she sensed Jonas was ready to hear whatever she had the courage to give. My home burned down 3 months ago. Jonas lifted his eyes, giving her full attention without a single word. Outlaws came through, took what they wanted, blamed me when they found little worth stealing. The town did the same. She paused, her breath trembling. Everyone I knew scattered. And I just kept moving. Jonas's jaw tightened slightly. I'm sorry. He said it softly but with weight, as though apologizing for the world's cruelty even though he had no part in it. She looked down at her hands. I never expected to end up on that platform. Jonas leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze steady and rooted. A platform doesn't decide a life. Only people do. His words fell like warm water on cold stone, softening a part of her she had armored for too long. When she rose to clear the bowls, Jonas stepped in beside her, reaching for the same dish. Their fingers brushed. Not enough to be intimate, but enough for her breath to catch, enough for him to pull back just slightly, as if careful not to startle a skittish horse. Something delicate passed between them then, an unspoken acknowledgement of the distance closing slowly, naturally. Outside, the sky darkened earlier than usual. A restless wind curled around the cabin walls, carrying with it a tension Eliza didn't understand until she stepped onto the porch and saw the faint trail of hoofprints leading toward the valley. Fresh ones. Jonas stood beside her a moment later, wiping his hands on a cloth, following her gaze. The stillness in him changed. Not fear but alertness, sharpened like a blade drawn halfway from its sheath. His eyes scanned the prints, then the open land beyond, where shadows pooled beneath the pine line. Company earlier. Stay back. Watching. Eliza's heart tightened. Barrett? Jonas didn't answer, which was answer enough. He guided her inside, shutting the door softly but with unmistakable resolve. She felt his concern like a heat through the room, subtle yet steady. He took the rifle from above the mantel, checked the chamber, then rested it against the wall, not as a threat but as a precaution. Eliza sank onto the edge of the bed, her breath uneven. I don't want trouble following you. Jonas knelt to add wood to the fire, his movements slow but firm. Trouble follows what it fears, not what it wants. She frowned softly. What does that mean? He straightened, brushing soot from his hands. It means Barrett doesn't want you back. He wants control. And he lost it yesterday. The truth settled over her like a new kind of cold, one that came not from winter, but from the memory of Barrett's eyes on her at the platform. Jonas noticed her trembling and moved to light the lantern near her side, its warm glow painting gold across her face. You'll be safe here. He said it with such quiet certainty that for a moment she believed him fully. But then the kitten hissed, a small warning sound, its gaze fixed on the window. Jonas's expression changed. Outside, a faint crunch of snow drifted through the darkening silence. Someone was standing just beyond the porch, waiting. Night lay thick around the cabin, the darkness pressing close to the windows like a living thing testing the strength of the light within. The lantern on the table flickered, casting warm circles on the wooden walls, yet doing nothing to quiet the sudden stillness in Jonas. He stood with his shoulders squared, his breath steady but deeper than before, his gaze fixed on the narrow window where the kitten's soft hiss had first turned the evening brittle. Eliza rose slowly from the bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the shawl around her shoulders. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were listening. She stepped closer to Jonas, not touching him but standing near enough that she could feel the heat of his presence, a quiet anchor in the uneasy dark. Her voice broke the silence with the softness of a frost-touched leaf falling from a branch. Who is out there? Jonas didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the window with silent steps, peering into the night. Outside, moonlight filtered through drifting clouds, spilling pale silver across the snow-covered yard. Nothing moved. Yet the air carried a tension that felt like a held breath. He turned, his face unreadable. Stay inside. Then he reached for his coat and rifle. Eliza stepped forward, her pulse quickening. Jonas. He paused in the doorway. I need to know who's prowling around my land. The words were calm, but his eyes carried a weight she'd seen once before, in men facing storms they could not fully predict. She wanted to argue, to ask him not to go alone, to say fear had already taken too much from her and she couldn't bear to lose safety now. But she knew Jonas Wilder was a man who moved for duty, not bravado. And this land, this cabin, this quiet life, these were things he protected with the same devotion he offered to the animals in his care. Jonas stepped outside into the cold. The wind curled around him, tugging at his coat as he descended the porch steps. Eliza watched from the window, her breath fogging the glass. The lantern's glow spilled onto the snow, reaching only a few feet before surrendering to the darkness. Jonas's figure moved to the edge of the yard, his posture alert, rifle held loosely but ready. The night answered him with silence. Eliza held the kitten close, feeling its tiny heart fluttering against her palm. The quiet stretched so long she felt it might snap in half. When Jonas finally returned to the porch, snow clung to his boots and coat, and his brows were drawn in a troubled line. Tracks. His voice was low. Fresh. 3 men. Her stomach tightened. Barrett? Jonas nodded slightly. And he's not alone. He shut the door softly as though not to disturb something fragile inside. Eliza sank onto the chair near the hearth, her breath unsteady. Jonas placed the rifle by the door and knelt to check the lock, his movements slow and purposeful. He stood again, looking at her in the fire's glow. They're testing the edges. Seeing if you're worth trouble. She swallowed hard. Am I? Jonas didn't flinch. Yes. Silence settled between them, softer now, almost tender. Eliza stared at the fire, watching flames lick the logs with delicate hunger. She had never been thought of as worth fighting for, not in her old life, not in town, not on the auction block. The memory stung, and yet it made Jonas's words feel heavier, warmer. He pulled another blanket from the chest and set it near her feet. He didn't touch her. He never assumed closeness, but the gesture held an intimacy that made her chest ache with something she didn't have a name for. You should sleep. I'll keep watch. She shook her head. You need rest too. He held her gaze a long moment before speaking. I'm used to long nights. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint creak of distant saddle leather or maybe the groan of a tree bending under frost. Jonas sat near the door, lantern beside him, rifle across his lap. Eliza watched him until her eyes grew heavy, the crackling of the fire weaving into the rhythm of her breath. The kitten curled on her lap, purring softly as though it knew the cabin was the safest place it had been. She drifted into sleep, but not deeply. Worry tugged her awake again and again. Each time her eyes fluttered open, she saw Jonas's steady silhouette framed by the doorway, his posture unyielding, his attention always drawn to the dark beyond the cabin. Hours passed. Snow fell thicker, blanketing the yard in quiet white. Sometime near dawn, the fire sighed low, and Jonas finally stood, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. Eliza, half awake, saw him move toward the window to check the horizon. His breath hitched, not in fear but in recognition. The sky held a faint blush of early light, but it wasn't the horizon that captured his gaze. It was the barn. A trail of footprints led straight inside, not Jonas's, not hers. Eliza sat fully upright, heart pounding. What is it? Jonas didn't answer. He grabbed his coat, the rifle, and crossed the room with the quiet urgency of a man who knew he could not wait. Stay here. This time his voice trembled, not with fear but with something more dangerous, the instinct to protect at all cost. Eliza rose despite the warning, moving toward him. Jonas, don't go in alone. His eyes softened for a single heartbeat. Someone has to stop what's coming. Before she could argue, he opened the door. Cold air burst inside, sweeping across her face. He stepped out into the pale morning, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he moved toward the barn with deliberate, unwavering steps. Eliza stood frozen, the kitten pressed against her chest, her breath forming small clouds of dread. Then from inside the barn she heard voices. Not 1, 3. Followed by the sound of something heavy falling. And Jonas's voice, quiet, controlled but sharpened like steel, cutting through the cold. Barrett, I knew you'd come crawling back. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Eliza staring at the barn as the sky brightened like the world holding its breath for what would happen next. The morning light stretched thin across the snow as Eliza stood frozen on the porch, her breath trembling in the cold. The distant sound of something striking wood echoed from the barn, followed by muffled voices, Barrett's rough growl, then another she did not recognize, then a third low murmur like someone giving orders. Jonas had disappeared into that barn with nothing but his steadiness and a rifle he rarely wished to use. Eliza clutched the kitten to her chest, her heart pounding against its small warmth. Fear tried to pull her backward, but another force, something deeper, pushed her forward. She stepped off the porch, boots sinking into fresh snow. The wind swept her hair across her face while her breath rose like smoke. Each step she took toward the barn felt heavier than the last. The world seemed to hold itself still, listening. When she reached the edge of the barn door, she paused only a moment before pressing her palm to the rough wood. The kitten mewed softly as if urging her on. Then she slid inside. The dim light revealed Jonas standing with his back toward her, facing Barrett and 2 other men she had never seen before. Barrett's hair plastered to his forehead, snow melting down his coat. Rage twisted his face into something almost unrecognizable. The two men flanking him held ropes and a rusted chain, their expressions ugly and eager. Barrett spat on the floorboards. Took her from under me, Jonas. Took something that wasn't yours. Thought you could make a fool of me in town. Jonas stood unmoving, the rifle lowered but ready. I didn't take. I protected. Protected? Barrett barked a harsh laugh. She's a stray with a mouthful of excuses. You should hear the stories they tell. Jonas's shoulders stiffened. Stories told by who? Men who treat women like currency? Barrett stepped forward, sneering at the ground between them. A man's got claim when he bids. Jonas's voice dropped to something dangerous. A bid isn't a claim. A woman isn't a prize. Barrett's face reddened until it looked bruised. He lifted his hand, signaling the two men, and they lunged forward with the chain. Jonas moved faster than Eliza had ever seen. He swung the rifle in a sharp arc, knocking the chain from one man's hands and sending him stumbling into a stack of hay bales. The other man caught Jonas's shoulder with a glancing blow before Jonas drove him back with the butt of the rifle. Eliza gasped, the sound catching in her throat. Jonas turned at the noise, his eyes widening when he saw her. Eliza, go back. But she shook her head, stepping farther into the barn. The kitten clung to her shawl as if sensing danger. Barrett saw her then, and a terrible smile cracked across his face. Well now, look who's wandered in. He moved toward her with a predator's slow confidence. Jonas lunged, but one of the men grabbed his coat, yanking him back. Jonas fought against the grip, but Barrett reached Eliza first. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with cruel force. You think you're worth all this trouble? All this money? Men like him don't keep strays. They get bored. Then they send you back where you belong. Eliza flinched but did not crumble. She met his eyes with a steadiness that surprised even her. I don't belong to anyone. Barrett sneered and tightened his grip. You belong to the highest bid. A sharp crack split through the air. Jonas had ripped free from the man holding him, swinging the rifle upward in a single motion. The wooden stock struck Barrett's arm with a force that made him howl and drop Eliza's wrist. Jonas stepped in front of her, positioning himself between her and all three men. His shoulders rose and fell with restrained fury. Touch her again and I will break more than your pride. Barrett staggered back, clutching his arm. You think you're some kind of hero? Jonas didn't answer. He raised the rifle, aiming it with calm precision, not at Barrett's chest but at the chain lying on the floor. He fired once. The shot rang through the barn, splintering the chain and sending shards scattering across the boards. The two men froze. Barrett paled. Jonas's voice emerged low and controlled. This cabin. This land. This woman. None of it is yours. Barrett's mouth opened but no sound came. His bravado melted, leaving only exposed fear. Jonas stepped forward, driving them back with nothing more than the certainty in his stance. Get off my land. And don't come back trailing trouble behind you. The two men scrambled toward the door, dragging Barrett with them. Outside, their horses whinnied in protest as they mounted in haste. Snow sprayed up behind them as they fled down the ridge, disappearing into the pale morning light. The barn fell silent except for the drifting of dust and the soft creak of settling beams. Jonas lowered the rifle. His breath steadied, but his hands shook slightly, a tremor of adrenaline he tried to hide. Eliza stepped toward him, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. He turned, eyes meeting hers, 1,000 unspoken things passing between them in the brief space where fear had lived a moment before. Are you hurt? Her voice wavered. He shook his head. You. She shook hers, though her wrist throbbed where Barrett had grabbed her. Jonas's jaw tightened at the sight of the bruise forming. He lifted her hand gently, his thumb brushing the tender skin with reverence instead of ownership. The touch sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire waiting back in the cabin. You should never have had to fear men like him. Her eyes glistened. And if you weren't here? Jonas's breath softened. Then I'd still be looking for you. The only difference is I found you sooner than most men deserve to find grace. Her chest tightened. Something inside her, a place left dry and cracked by months of wandering, began to thaw, filling with warmth as steady as winter sunlight. Jonas lowered her hand slowly as if returning something precious. Come back inside. You're shaking. She nodded, stepping closer, unable to break the invisible thread tying her to him. The kitten leapt from her shawl and scurried ahead, leading the way as though it knew the path better than either of them. As they walked toward the cabin, the wind softened, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a day not yet broken. Eliza felt the bruise on her wrist, felt the steadiness of Jonas beside her, and realized the fear that had shadowed her for so long had begun to loosen its hold. Just before they reached the porch, Jonas spoke again, his voice almost hesitant. "If you stay, you won't be staying out of debt or obligation. You'll be staying because this is your home. If you want it." Eliza turned to him, breath trembling in the cold air. "And if I say yes?" Jonas looked at her as though the world had narrowed to a single heartbeat. "Then winter ends for both of us." But before Eliza could answer, the kitten froze on the porch rail, fur raised, staring past them into the forest shadows, where a final, unexpected movement stirred beneath the trees.